In August 1917, a British tank crew found themselves in a technological cage. Their machine sank into the Flemish mud in the middle of no man's land. Metal tracks grind against wet clay. They spin, but the hull doesn't move. The engine screams, then stalls. For 3 days, the crew remained trapped in this steel box, isolated between the lines. Why did the war stop? Technology of slaughter outpaced the tactics of movement. By the end of 1914, the Western Front had mutated into an unplanned monster. It was a continuous line of earthworks stretching from the Belgian coast to the Swiss border. 700 kilometers of solid fortification, where the price of advancement was measured in thousands of lives for every meter. The math of the Great War was simple and lethal. Bolt-action rifles and Maxim machine guns turned open fields into kill zones. Artillery could erase a battalion before it even saw the enemy. The landscape died. Soldiers dug in. What remained was a strip of pulverized earth, craters, and rusted wire. Massed infantry charges failed. Cavalry became obsolete. Defenders behind a single machine gun could liquidate an entire wave of attackers. The front solidified into a permanent bleeding scar. Neither side could move forward. Both armies remained frozen in a state of total operational paralysis. Deep concrete bunkers. German engineers designed them specifically to withstand days of heavy-caliber shelling. To break the 700-kilometer deadlock, the High Command in 1916 and 1917 bet on massive artillery terror. They believed in volume. If the bayonet failed, the howitzer would succeed. The logic was simple: pound the trenches for days, flatten the barbed wire, collapse every dugout, then send the infantry to occupy the ruins. It was a mathematical delusion. The shelling moved millions of tons of earth. It didn't clear a path. It destroyed the very surface needed for an advance. Lush fields turned into a lunar nightmare of overlapping craters and liquid mud. The defense evolved faster than the destruction. German soldiers waited in the deep concrete silence while the surface disintegrated. The moment the barrage lifted, they manned their guns. Other solutions failed just as bloodily. Command tried poison gas. They sent small teams of trench raiders into the dark. They launched desperate night attacks. The geography of the front remained frozen. Tactics had reached a dead end. Every major offensive ended with the same result: 0 meters gained for every 10,000 lives lost. While the War Office dismissed failure as a soldier's lack of grit, the Admiralty took a different path. Innovation did not come from the Army. It came from the sea. How did the Navy end up building a land weapon? The Army leadership had completely abandoned technical progress. In late 1914, Major Ernest Swinton proposed an armored tractor for trench warfare. The Army ignored him. Swinton turned to Winston Churchill. Churchill sat in his office at the Admiralty. He picked up a pen. He signed a memorandum in early 1915. The document described a bulletproof tractor with armored compartments for men and machine guns. A landship. Paperwork shuffled through the halls. The dry rustle of memos hid a bureaucratic anomaly. Churchill authorized the Landships Committee. He used naval funds to build a machine for the mud. It was a blatant breach of the chain of command. The Navy designed the prototypes. They used maritime budgets to solve a terrestrial nightmare. Engineers worked in shadows. The War Office knew nothing. The Admiralty moved forward in total silence, hiding the entire project from the Ministry of War. Engineers looked at a theoretical concept from 1903. H.G. Wells had described it in a short story. He called them land ironclads. For a decade, the idea remained fiction. Then the trenches made it a necessity. The task was a physics problem. Steel armor had to move across a graveyard of mud and wire. Standard wheels sank. Heavy plates crushed the axles. The solution came from the grain fields. Agricultural tractor tracks distributed 5 tons of weight across a wide surface. This was a pragmatic assembly of existing parts. No futuristic breakthroughs were required. Internal combustion engines had enough horsepower. Naval shipyards produced the hardened steel plate. Welders joined maritime armor to farming chassis. Expectation: a sleek, high-tech weapon of the future. Reality: a brutal box of industrial scrap and tractor parts. The machine needed to flatten barbed wire and span a 2-meter gap. It was a mathematical synthesis of naval protection and agrarian logistics. The theoretical blueprint had waited since 1903. By late 1915, the blueprints had transformed into physical mass. Admiral Tyrwhitt bypassed the War Office entirely. He moved the project forward in silence. This was no longer a naval experiment. It was an industrial operation that required a lie. Why give massive armored machines the name of water containers? Counterintelligence needed a legend for the shipments to Russia. They chose the word tank. If a spy spotted the steel hulls on a train, the manifest showed water storage units. The label intended for a crate became the name of a new class of weapon. Design followed a brutal trial and error. The first prototype, Little Willie, was a boxy failure. It moved, it carried a crew, but it died in the mud of the testing grounds. The machine could not cross a standard Western Front trench. Engineering shifted to the mother prototype in early 1916. It was longer. The hull formed a distinctive diamond. The tracks did not sit under the machine. They wrapped around the entire body. Steel plates groaned as the rhomboid shape climbed. It hit the lip of a wide trench, tilted, and clawed its way to the other side. The mother's diamond silhouette was not a stylistic choice. It was a mathematical solution to the geometry of a cratered landscape. The government saw the result. They did not wait for final blueprints. They ordered 100 units immediately. By mid-1916, the Mark I entered mass production. The factory split the line into 2 breeds. Males carried twin 6-pounder cannons inside sponsons. Females carried only machine guns to sweep infantry from the wire. Cranes swung the finished Mark Is onto railway platforms. Dock workers tightened the chains. Tarpaulins covered the steel, hiding the cannons and the tracks from view. The first serial machines began their secret transit to the ports of France. 49 secret machines were prepared for the strike. More than half failed to even reach the starting line. Mechanical breakdown proved more effective than enemy fire. The British High Command refused to wait for technical refinement. In September 1916, during the Somme offensive, they committed their raw prototypes to the Battle of Flers-Courcelette. Why send secret weapons into combat when 50% fail before the first shot? The General Staff was desperate for a breakthrough. They chose tactical surprise over operational readiness. The tanks crawled at 3 to 4 miles per hour. This was slower than a soldier at a walking pace. On the broken ground of the Somme, the massive iron boxes became near-stationary targets for coordinated artillery. Panic hit the German trenches first. Soldiers watched armored shapes emerge from the smoke, crushing barbed wire and ignoring rifle fire. For men who understood the limits of lead and steel, this was a nightmare. Many dropped their Mausers and surrendered. Others simply ran. The psychological blow was massive, but the mechanical reality was hollow. Out of the initial 49 tanks, only a fraction achieved their objectives. The machines stalled in craters or shed their tracks in the mud. Once the initial shock faded, German officers noted the flaws. The official German report dismissed the British tanks as primitive and ineffective. Engineers prioritized armor over the men inside. They built a steel box and dropped a 100-horsepower petrol engine in the center. No partitions, no ventilation. The Mark V was 8 meters of iron and 2.5 meters of toxic air. 8 men lived and fought within inches of the exposed flywheel. The commander signals the start. A mechanic cranks the handle. The motor roars, filling the cabin with a deafening metallic scream. You cannot hear the man next to you. To give an order, the commander grabs a soldier and shouts directly into his ear. Communication is a physical struggle. Then comes the heat. Within minutes, the internal temperature climbs to 50 degrees Celsius. This exceeds modern survival limits for physical labor in enclosed spaces. The air turns thick. Blue exhaust smoke mixes with boiling oil and raw fuel. Every shot from the 6-pounder adds a cloud of burnt cordite. The soot sticks to the sweat on their faces. It coats their lungs. A black, oily film covers every surface, including the drinking water. How does a human body react to this chemical trap? The crew experiences tank sickness. It starts with a splitting headache. Then the lungs begin to burn from carbon monoxide. Men lose their sense of balance. Operations lasted for hours. By the end, the crew did not walk out. They crawled. Soldiers staggered into the mud, vomiting and collapsing from acute poisoning. It was a systematic failure of ergonomics. The machine was killing its own long before the enemy fired a shot. The crews simply called it tank sickness. Even if 8 men survived the 50-degree heat and toxic fumes, operating the 30-ton machine remained a blind lottery. Armor offered the illusion of safety. The reality was a kinetic trap. A German Mauser bullet strikes the exterior. It does not penetrate the 10mm steel. Instead, the impact sends a shockwave through the plate. On the inside, jagged shards of the tank's own hull snap off at supersonic speeds. The British called it spalling. These internal splinters turned the cabin into a localized fragmentation hex. How do you steer a steel box without a steering wheel? 3 men must pull levers in perfect synchronization while deafened by the engine. The driver sits up front. 2 gearsmen stand by the tracks. Coordination happens through screamed orders or desperate hand signals in the dark. One mistimed pull on a brake lever snaps a drive chain. The tank becomes a stationary target. Visibility was a luxury. The driver peered through a slit 2 inches wide. He saw nothing to his flanks. Under the tracks, the screams of his own wounded infantry went unheard over the roar of the 100-horsepower motor. Then came the lead splash. When a rifle volley hit the vision slits, the bullets liquefied on impact. Molten lead sprayed through the gaps like a pressurized hose. It blinded men in seconds. The War Office responded with medieval solutions. They issued heavy leather and steel face masks, thick circular eye plates, chainmail curtains hanging to the chest to catch hot metal. The crews looked like iron knights trapped in a chemical furnace. Inside the 120-degree cabin, the masks became unbreathable. Sweat and condensation blinded the wearers faster than the enemy. Tankers began throwing the heavy steel masks into the mud of the floor. To compensate for technical blindness and the lethal rain of internal spalling, the British High Command shifted its focus from quality to mass. In November 1917, the generals prepared a gamble. Designers had refined the steel box. The Mark V emerged as the backbone of the Royal Tank Corps. It retained the rhomboid silhouette, but carried thicker armor and a relocated fuel cell to delay the inevitable furnace. On the roof sat an unditching beam, a massive timber intended to pull 30 tons of steel from the Flemish mud. How did the brass plan to fix a failing machine? They decided to overwhelm the enemy with numbers. At Cambrai, the British massed over 370 tanks. It was the first coordinated strike of its scale. On the first day, the Hindenburg Line snapped. The machines punched through 3 trench systems and advanced 5 miles in 24 hours. Compare the scale. In 1916, 5 miles of mud cost tens of thousands of lives over months of slaughter. Now the same distance took 1 day. But the breakthrough lacked a foundation. The tanks outpaced their support. Mechanical failures stalled the advance as engines seized and tracks snapped. German batteries recovered, picking off the isolated iron hulks one by one. The infantry reserves were too far back to hold the new perimeter. 10 days later, the German counteroffensive reclaimed every inch of the captured ground. British gains returned to zero. How to stop a steel monster? German engineers answered with a 13mm argument. By August 1917, the British celebration of the Cambrai breakthrough had faded. The German industrial response was already hitting the front lines. It started with the K bullet, an armor-piercing round with a hardened steel core. Standard rifle fire bounced off the plates. These rounds bit through. When the British thickened the armor on the Mark IV, the Kaiser's engineers scaled up. They deployed the Mauser Tankgewehr, a massive 13mm anti-tank rifle. The weapon weighed 41 pounds. It fired a heavy steel-cored bolt at nearly 800 meters per second. The kinetic impact was absolute. The round punched a clean hole through 20 millimeters of hardened plate. Inside the hull, the energy of the hit turned the tank's own armor into a spray of lethal fragments. But the German VPK was not the only enemy. Geography became a weapon of mass destruction. In the Ypres sector, the Earth had ceased to exist. Heavy rain and constant shelling turned the battlefield of Passchendaele into a literal swamp. No Man's Land was a landscape of overlapping, waterlogged craters. The mud was a thick, black slurry. It swallowed men. It drowned horses. In August 1917, a Mark IV mail tank prepared to enter this chemical and geological hell. The crew nicknamed it Fray Bentos. It was the name of a popular brand of tinned meat. A grim piece of soldier's humor, 8 men sealed in a pressurized steel can. Before the first shot was fired, the crew of Fray Bentos would find themselves trapped in a multi-day siege, buried alive in a shell hole. The command ordered the tank to support the assault near the village of St. Julian, August 22nd. 4:40 in the morning, the crew of Fray Bentos moved into the black sludge of no man's land. Visibility was zero. Dynamic movement was the only shield against the German batteries waiting at Somme Farm. A German machine gun opened fire from the ruins. The tank pivoted. The left 6-pounder barked until the nest went silent. Richardson ordered the machine toward the next objective, a rise labeled Gallipoli. How does a 28-ton Predator become a tomb in 1 second? At 5:45, the ground vanished. A hidden shell crater, masked by liquid mud, swallowed the front bogies. The Mark IV groaned. Steel shrieked against stone. The tracks lost their bite. One side of the tank rose into the air, while the other buried itself in the muck. The 105-horsepower Daimler engine roared in neutral, but the physics were terminal. A 28-ton mass at a 45-degree angle is no longer a vehicle. It is an obstacle. The glass in the vision slits shattered. A German bullet found the gap and tore through 2nd Lieutenant George Hill's neck. Blood sprayed the interior casing. Hill collapsed, his body slumping directly over the steering mechanism. Richardson lunged across the cramped, oil-slicked cabin to grab the levers. As the Fray Bentos sank deeper into the mud, a silent timer started. The machine was a fortress. It was also a biological trap. Standard British tank regulations were precise. Each crew carried water and rations for exactly 24 hours of autonomous operation. By the morning of August 23rd, the containers were dry. The biscuits were gone. How does a high-tech armored capsule become a tomb? The answer lay in the air. Outside, the hull deflected bullets. Inside, the temperature climbed toward 40 degrees Celsius. The atmosphere turned into a toxic soup of cordite, oil fumes, and the stench of unwashed wounds. Captain Richardson watched his men reach their limit. Contrast. On paper, the Mark IV was the pinnacle of modern warfare. In the mud of Somme Farm, it was a steel box filled with vomit and blood. The crew was entering their 3rd day of isolation. Exhaustion became physical pain. Every time a man drifted toward sleep, a German shell or the scream of a wounded comrade snapped him back. Bud remained unconscious for 2 hours. The others operated on raw adrenaline and thirst. By the evening of August 24th, the clock hit 60 hours. The systemic crisis had reached its breaking point. Human biology could no longer sustain the defense of the machine. Richardson looked at the empty water tins and the pale faces of his crew. He gave the order to prepare for evacuation. The crew began stripping the machine of its teeth. They dismantled the Lewis guns. They packed the remaining ammunition. Richardson personally oversaw the final act of sabotage by removing the steel breech blocks from the 6-pounder cannons. The manual was clear. To save 28 tons of dead weight, 2 men had to step into the meat grinder. The unditching beam was the only official solution. It required 2 crewmen to remain outside the armor for at least 4 minutes. In the mud of Passchendaele, 4 minutes was an eternity. What happens when the rescue manual ignores the reality of machine guns? At 7 in the morning, the mechanical failure became a death sentence. Sergeant Robert Mission kicked open the right sponson door. He gripped the heavy iron chain. 30 yards away, German infantry leveled their rifles. Bullets sparked against the steel inches from his face. Mission retreated. On the left, Lance Corporal Ernest Brady wasn't as fast. He climbed out into the chaos to secure the gear. A German machine gun team caught his silhouette against the pale sky. A single burst. Brady collapsed. Through the narrow vision slits, the crew watched his body. It didn't move. The heavy Flanders mud slowly began to swallow the corpse. The tank was now a tilted steel fortress sinking into its own grave. One 6-pounder gun pointed uselessly into the dirt. Captain Richardson ordered the other to fire. They targeted Gallipoli Farm, the source of the incoming lead. The Lewis guns joined in, spraying every moving shadow. But the wider battle was disintegrating. The 61st Division's attack collapsed under the weight of German counterfire. Wave after wave of British infantry fell. The survivors turned back. The soldiers scrambled through the craters toward their original starting lines. The infantry disappeared into the safety of the rear trenches. The British infantry retreated to the starting trenches. 61st Division vanished into the rear. The tank, Fray Bentos, sat alone. 28 tons of steel tilted in the mud of no man's land. Isolation became a tactical anomaly. The Germans realized the machine was a static fortress. Small squads began crawling through the craters. They moved toward the blind spots. The crew was trapped in a mechanical grave. Because of the tilt, the mounted Lewis guns could not angle down. The enemy reached the trenches directly in front of the hull. They were too close to kill with heavy weapons. How does an elite crew defend a blind spot? Rifles. Sergeant Misson and the men grabbed personal sidearms. They fired through small revolver ports. One German soldier climbed onto the hull. He dropped a grenade through an opening. The crew caught it. They threw it back into the mud before the blast. The interior was a slaughterhouse. Metal fragments flaked off the walls from every impact. Bullet splashes through vision slits blinded the men. Every man bled except for one gunner named Binley. Outside, the body of Lance Corporal Brady remained visible in the muck. Then the sound changed. Dull thuds hit the armor from the British side. The British lines had opened fire. Snipers from their own division assumed the Germans had captured the tank. Fray Bentos was now a target for both armies. Sergeant Misson opened the hatch. He crawled into the open ground. He moved toward the British trenches under a crossfire of friendly and enemy bullets. He reached the infantry and gave a single order to stop the shooting. Then Misson turned around and crawled back into the steel trap. 72 hours, 1 dead, 7 wounded. Richardson gave the order to evacuate. The steel coffin had reached its limit. Before leaving, the crew dismantled the firing blocks of the 6-pounder guns. They dropped the heavy breech blocks into the oily sludge on the floor. British imperial doctrine was clear. Technology must not fall to the Kaiser's engineers. Engineering secrets outweighed the lives of those protecting them. How does a state treat those whose bodies cannot be recovered? It erases them into statistics. At 9 in the evening on August 24th, the escape began. 8 men crawled into the liquid mud of Flanders. Above them, German magnesium flares turned the night into a white, flickering surgery room. They moved between flooded craters. Every splash drew machine gun fire. The men refused to leave their weapons. They dragged heavy Lewis guns through the silt, inching toward the British lines. By the early hours of August 25th, sentries pulled the survivors into the trenches. The crew did not ask for food or sleep first. They demanded an immediate artillery strike on their own tank. The logic of the Great War remained consistent: destroy the machine to save the secret. Bureaucracy followed the blood. The crew of Fray Bentos became the most decorated in the history of the Royal Tank Corps. Richardson and Hill received the Military Cross. Medals were pinned to chests. Reports were filed in neat columns. But the paperwork had no room for Private Brady. He had died in the first hour, trying to unstick the tracks. His body remained in the muck, a piece of biological debris ignored by the medal citations. His name is now carved into the stone of the Tyncott Memorial. He is one of 35,000,